Imagine opening your front door and seeing flashing police lights, officers with weapons drawn, and your entire neighborhood watching in fear. But here's the shocking part. It wasn't criminals they were after. It was him. And why? Because his own homeowners association told the police, if he resists, shoot. Can you believe that? Now picture this. Instead of panicking, instead of fighting back, this man calmly walks into his yard, grabs a shovel, and begins digging right there in front of the police, the HOA, and all his neighbors. Everyone thinks he's about to uncover something terrifying, maybe weapons, maybe something illegal, but what comes out of the ground leaves everyone frozen in disbelief. The truth wasn't dangerous. It was heartbreaking. Buried in that yard was a secret so powerful, it exposed lies, corruption, and the dark side of the very people who were supposed to protect the community. Why would an HOA go this far? What were they so afraid he might reveal? Trust me, once you hear this full story, you won't be able to look away. So stay with us until the very end. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel had always believed that a home was more than 4 walls and a roof. It was memory, history, and the silent presence of those who once lived there. His little house at the edge of the cul-de-sac was modest compared to the carefully polished homes surrounding it. But to him, it was perfect. The lawn wasn't cut with ruler straight lines, the garden often bloomed unevenly, and the paint on the porch had long lost its shine. But inside that imperfection was authenticity, something the Homeowners Association despised. For months, Daniel had received letters warning him about minor infractions, a tool left near the shed, a flower bed that grew too wild, a holiday decoration that overstayed its approved time. To him it felt like harassment, but he endured. He thought patience would earn him peace. He was wrong. On a quiet Saturday morning, he returned from the hardware store to see flashing red and blue lights painting his street. Patrol cars lined the sidewalks. Officers stood in cautious stances, and neighbors gathered in murmurs of fear and curiosity. At first, he thought perhaps there had been an accident, maybe a break-in. But then his eyes caught the stern faces of the HOA board members huddled near the officers, gesturing toward his house as though it were a threat to the entire community. A chill ran down his spine. The commanding officer's words carried heavy in the air. We were told if he resists, we're to take no chances. Daniel froze in disbelief. Him? Resist? He wasn't even home when this started. Slowly he stepped forward, announcing his presence with a calm but steady voice. All eyes turned. A neighbor gasped. One of the officers raised a hand, instructing him to stop. The HOA president, a man named Gerald with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, pointed at him. That's him. He's hiding something in his yard, something dangerous. We told you he'd fight back. Daniel's voice did not shake, though his heart thundered. There's nothing dangerous here, but I can prove it. Let me dig. The words caused a ripple of confusion. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, trained by protocol but pulled by the tone of sincerity in his voice. After 10 seconds, the commanding officer gave a cautious nod. All right, show us. The crowd leaned in as Daniel walked past the officers, his hands raised to show no threat, and entered his yard. He fetched a shovel leaning near the porch, ironically the very shovel the HOA once warned him about for being left in view. With deliberate movements, he pressed the blade into the soil. Each thrust of dirt echoed in the silence, the tension of the moment making even the birds in the trees pause their song. Sweat gathered on his brow, not from the labor but from the weight of dozens of eyes locked on him, waiting for proof of guilt or proof of innocence. His mind drifted back to his father, who had once whispered to him when he was young. One day, you'll understand why this place matters. There are things buried deeper than soil here. Daniel hadn't thought much of it then, but now, as his shovel struck against something solid, the words rang louder. A muffled gasp rippled through the crowd. Daniel knelt, brushing the dirt aside with his hands, revealing a worn, weather-stained wooden box. He lifted it carefully, its hinges creaking as though they were sighing with age. With everyone watching, he opened it. Instead of danger, instead of weapons or contraband, inside lay bundles of letters tied with faded string, photographs curled with time, and a small journal with his father's initials embossed in the corner. Silence blanketed the street, Gerald's face drained of color. An officer stepped forward, inspecting the contents with delicate hands. "These are letters, family documents." Daniel nodded, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My father buried them years ago. He said they carried the story of who we are. I didn't fully understand, but I kept them safe. And now you see, there's nothing dangerous here, just memory." At that moment, the narrative shifted. The officers looked not at a potential suspect, but at a man standing with the weight of his family's past in his hands. Neighbors whispered among themselves, doubt creeping into the accusations. Why would the HOA escalate to this? Over papers and photographs? And why had they told the police to prepare for violence? The commanding officer closed the box gently and gave a nod of respect toward Daniel. "This isn't what we were told." The crowd stirred, and for the first time, suspicion turned not toward Daniel but toward the HOA board. Gerald stammered, attempting to regain control. He could have hidden something else. That box could be a cover. You can't just believe him. But his words carried no conviction. The people had seen the truth with their own eyes. Daniel, however, felt the moment was far from over. He looked at the journal in his hands and realized he had never opened it. With trembling fingers, he flipped the cover. The first page, written in his father's familiar handwriting, held a message that nearly stole his breath. "To my son, if you ever read this, it means the day has come when truth is no longer safe to speak aloud. These words, these records, are my gift to you, and perhaps your burden. The fight I once faced may find its way to you." Daniel's heart pounded. His father had lived through battles Daniel had never known, struggles against forces that wanted silence instead of accountability. And now here he stood, in front of police, neighbors, and an HOA that wanted him discredited, holding a key that might explain everything. The crowd leaned forward again, hooked not just by the drama of the scene but by the unfolding story hidden in those pages. And Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the journal, the faint smell of aged paper rising as though carrying whispers from the past. The police, the neighbors, even the restless HOA members fell silent, their curiosity overpowering the tension that had hung over the street moments before. Daniel turned another page, his father's handwriting steady and purposeful. "The truth," the words began, "is seldom welcomed by those who profit from silence. I once fought a battle in a neighborhood much like this one, where the association that claimed to protect us instead consumed us. They used fear, they used lies, and they turned neighbors into enemies. I left behind proof, but more importantly, I left behind a lesson. Courage is found not in raising your voice, but in refusing to surrender your truth." Daniel read in silence, his lips moving slightly with the words, until he felt the stares pressing harder against him. He closed the journal and lifted his gaze. "My father wasn't hiding anything dangerous," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "He was hiding what mattered, our history, our story, and the truth of what people in power sometimes do to keep others quiet." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The commanding officer, his earlier sternness replaced with something softer, nodded slowly. "We'll need to look into this further," he said, glancing at Gerald and the other HOA board members. Gerald's jaw tightened, his confident facade cracking. "This is ridiculous. You're letting him stage a performance. That book, those letters, he could have planted them himself." Daniel shook his head calmly. "If I planted them, why would they be weathered with years of soil? Why would they carry my father's handwriting, a man most of you never even met? Truth doesn't need performance, Gerald. It only needs daylight." The neighbors shifted, their loyalty wavering. For years they had followed the HOA's rules, some reluctantly, others willingly. But in this moment, Daniel had shown something the HOA never offered: transparency. He invited them to see for themselves. The officers took the box into evidence, though gently, respectfully. "We'll have handwriting analysts confirm," the officer said. "But at first glance, this looks authentic." Gerald barked a bitter laugh. "Analysts? Evidence? Over a box of dusty papers? You're wasting everyone's time." Yet his voice cracked, and everyone noticed. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Larkin, an elderly woman known for keeping to herself, suddenly stepped forward. "He's not wasting our time," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "For years, we've been told what we can and can't do. We've been fined, threatened, belittled, and we went along with it because we thought there was no choice. But maybe Daniel's right. Maybe we've been afraid of the wrong people." The crowd stirred again, this time with louder agreement. Gerald's face reddened, his control slipping away like sand through fingers. Daniel watched, both surprised and humbled, as voices rose in support. But he knew this wasn't over. The journal still had pages unturned, and with every page came more of his father's story. Later that night, after the police had left with their evidence and the neighbors had returned to their homes buzzing with whispers, Daniel sat at his kitchen table. A single lamp lit the journal before him, casting long shadows across the room. He opened to the next entry. "If they come for you," his father had written, "it will not be because of what you've done wrong, but because of what you could reveal. Keep your heart steady. Fear feeds them, but courage starves them." Daniel closed his eyes, the words sinking deep. He realized then that the HOA's hostility had not been about weeds, shovels, or uneven flower beds. It had been about intimidation, distraction, a way to break him down before he discovered what they truly feared: exposure. He thought of the meetings he had skipped, the notices he had ignored, the financial statements the HOA mailed out each year that never quite added up. His father had fought similar battles. Now it was his turn. The next morning, Daniel requested to see the HOA's public financial records, documents legally owed to every resident. Gerald and the board resisted, but under the sudden attention of the police investigation, they had no choice. What Daniel found was staggering: hidden expenses, inflated charges, funds siphoned to companies that didn't exist. Fraud laid bare on the page. By noon, word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors gathered on Daniel's lawn, demanding answers. The HOA board, once feared, stood cornered. Gerald tried to shout over the voices, insisting Daniel was twisting the truth, but the papers spoke louder than he did. Police returned, this time not to watch Daniel dig, but to escort board members into cars for questioning. And still, through the noise, Daniel felt the weight of his father's words guiding him. Courage is not in raising your voice, but in refusing to surrender your truth. Days passed, investigations deepened, and the community began to change. Where there was once suspicion and fear, there grew conversation and connection. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now shared stories, frustrations, and laughter. Daniel became a quiet symbol, not of rebellion, but of resilience. He had not fought with fists or fury. He had simply unearthed what was buried and trusted the truth to stand on its own. Yet even in the calm that followed, he never forgot the moment he stood before the officers, accused of danger, and chose instead to dig. It had been a gamble, a desperate act of faith, and it had changed everything. Weeks later, the HOA dissolved under pressure, replaced by a new council elected by the residents themselves. Gerald and his allies faced charges for fraud and abuse of power. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear, slowly healed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with amber light, Daniel returned to the patch of soil where it all began. The grass had not yet grown back, the earth still scarred by the hole he had dug. Kneeling down, he placed the journal back into the box, now empty of secrets but full of strength. He whispered softly, as though his father could still hear, "We did it." The truth was enough. Rising to his feet, he felt lighter than he had in years. Around him, the sounds of children playing, neighbors chatting, and life returning filled the air. The house was still modest, the porch still worn, the garden still imperfect. But now, those imperfections were no longer judged. They were celebrated because they were real. And in that reality, Daniel found peace. The story of the buried box became legend in the neighborhood, a tale told to newcomers as both a warning and a reminder. Power built on fear cannot outlast the courage of truth. And though Daniel never sought to be a hero, his quiet act of digging, of showing instead of shouting, became the moment that saved them all.